This original WSRE presentation is made possible by viewers like you. Thank you.
He is defining the true meaning of adventure. Australian explorer Tim Cope on this edition of Conversations. Australian explorer Tim Cope is not your typical traveler. His method of transportation is much less jet airplane or RV and more primitive, like horses, camels, and bicycles. He's most well known for the Trail of Genghis Khan, traveling by horseback from Mongolia to the Danube River in Hungary, an adventure that took him 3.5 years. Other feats include rowing a boat across Siberia and bicycling across Russia and Mongolia. Cope's style of travel is to immerse himself into the local culture and absorb the lifestyle of the natives. Tim Cope has brought his adventures to both print and film. His book, On the Trail of Genghis Khan, was a bestseller in Australia. It's also been published in the United States and the UK, as well as other places around the world. His film work includes a documentary by the same name. Here's a preview.
When I was 20 years old, my friend Chris and I were cycling across Mongolia. While struggling through the Gobi Desert one day, these amazing wild horsemen came galloping from over the horizon. They headed off to places that our bikes could never have gone. These people had a world without boundaries. From here in Mongolia stretched the Great Eurasian Steppe to Hungary, and their ancestors were once warriors who crossed this vast space. It inspired in me a dream to live the life of a nomad and ride a horse from Mongolia to the Danube. I never imagined what lay before me. Long nights alone menaced by wolves and thieves, impossible mountain passes, and the most extreme climate on Earth. I'd even be caught in a war between sedentary and nomad people and face a personal tragedy that almost ended my journey. But I was driven on by an old nomad wisdom. To understand the wolf, you must put on the skin of a wolf and see through its eyes.
Absolutely fascinating. From Australia, we welcome Tim Cope to Conversations. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
How did it all begin? How did you become this adventurer that you are?
It's a very good question. I think I was very fortunate to have a father who was into the outdoors. In fact, I grew up in a little rural area of southeast Australia, and as a kid I remember him taking myself and my 2 brothers and sister out into the wilderness, into the mountains, cross-country skiing, sea kayaking journeys, surfing. And in all of those experiences, I remember kind of moments where I'd sit on a hill and look into the distance and wonder what was beyond that horizon, perhaps imagine myself a little speck dwarfed by all that enormity of the world. I also learnt that in wilderness it's a place where life itself becomes distilled. You know, there's no mobile phones, there's no friends or family, and it made me realise that over time that when it comes to life's challenges and everything else, it's your human qualities that matter most, and that's something that I keep going back out there for, whether it be travel or a hiking journey. By learning about the world around myself and learning about other cultures, I learn a lot about myself. And but it's also true that when I finished school, I got into a law degree that my father was very happy about. But about half a year into it, I realised that for me, studying law at that time was a slow death. So I found a way out, which was to study as a wilderness guide in Finland for a year. And that was a remarkable course where we went into the Arctic. We weren't allowed to take tents. We'd have to make snow caves or build shelters. We learnt the traditional methods of surviving out there, relying on our knowledge rather than our equipment. And it made me understand that for Indigenous cultures across the world, for them what we may sometimes consider to be places where humans don't belong, for them it's their garden. It's what sustains them. And I wanted to understand across many different areas of the world what the world looked like from their point of view. You know, to us, for example, the reindeer herders of the Arctic, that they may live in pretty hostile conditions, but for them it's their home, and I think that culture evolves hand in glove with the environment, and that's what's kind of sparked my interest.
As you have met different people through your travels and adventures, what stands out? What stands out the most about people themselves?
I think that for one, I've personally had to learn on my journeys to appeal to the better side of human beings, no matter who they are. On my horseback journey in particular, I mean, it was 3.5 years. It was planned to be 18 months. I was on a shoestring budget of maybe about $5 or $10 a day. Often my horses were tired. I'd turn up in a small nomad community, tired and weary on my feet. I'd be looking for food, shelter. I didn't have the luxury to choose my friends according to how I saw these people on the surface. Whether they may have been, good people or bad, I had to appeal to that better side, and everyone has a good side, and that made me extend myself. And I remember one very difficult occasion in the middle of Kazakhstan in the winter time. I'd been riding with the horses across a place called the Starving Steppe. It's a very, very bleak kind of area in the winter, a bit like, if you can imagine for a moment, a big frozen Arctic sea, really.
Okay.
Nomads had never been there in the winter time. At this time, it was 2 days to Christmas. One of the horses had an abscess in its back hoof. The tent was falling apart. My dog Tiggin was at risk of getting frostbite on his feet. But more than that, I did not want to be out here alone at Christmas time. So I pulled out the map, and my GPS had stopped working properly, but I managed to get a compass bearing and rode to the nearest town as quickly as I could. I guess I'd imagined at that stage that there'd be a family with a roast on the table waiting for me, a barn full of hay for the animals. It was nothing of the kind. In fact, this town, Akbakai, was a gold mining village, a very bankrupt and isolated one. And the only people waiting for me were these two shadowy figures on the edges of town who invited me in to their mud hut, which was fine. I was warm, I wasn't alone, but in the morning things got pretty difficult. My two hosts were people in pretty difficult condition. Grisha and Vitka were actually Russians who'd ended up in this kind of island of a town several years before. They'd actually lost their truck driving licenses drunk at the wheel.
Okay.
Unfortunately, Grisha and Vitka were afflicted with alcoholism, and they said, "Tim, don't worry about it, have a cup of tea. You're going to have a wonderful winter with us." I went to look for food for the animals. There was none. I came back. They'd actually cooked up a couple of pigeons they'd caught on the street, and I'll never forget waking up the next morning, calling home on the satellite phone that I had with me and saying Happy Christmas to my family. And that was one of the moments when I really wanted a moment to take a break from the travel, to be around friends and family. I think in all my previous travels, journeying had been about getting away from the familiar, from home, as far as possible. But this was a journey that taught me time and time again of the value of family and friends. But to cut a long story short, I was stuck in this town for the next 3 months.
Oh, wow.
And every time I tried to leave, something went wrong. The petrol stove broke in a storm. I came back, I lost all my fuel. There was a moment when I got the flu, and then Tiggin was stolen by some unemployed miners, unfortunately that were eating stray dogs and pet dogs to survive. But what struck me was that although to begin with my difficulties kind of defined my stay there, in the end I realised they were insignificant, and that this experience led me to a much greater understanding of the turbulent times these people were living through. Most people there were living by working in the contraband gold mining industry, rappelling 400 metres into mine shafts, digging it up. Everyone had their own little backyard labs. In the end, these same people who had their own failings and problems, they were incredibly kind to me, and they taught me one very valuable lesson among others, actually, that there's this great philosophy they have, which is if you have to rush in life, rush slowly. And they taught me to embrace problems, to have patience and resilience, that I would have my time when it came. And that time did come. I had my window of opportunity to ride on, but I've never forgotten that in that situation, in other circumstances, I might have bailed and gone home. But with my horses and my dog, I couldn't leave them behind. I needed to appeal to the better side of these human beings, no matter who they were. And by doing that, I got to see the best side of human beings, and the worst at times.
Right.
But I think that's something that struck me, that humans are essentially good no matter where you go. And you know, before I went, I might have gotten some warnings about. I remember one Mongolian before I left Mongolian saying that I probably wouldn't survive more than a week in Kazakhstan without a gun. But it couldn't have been more to the contrary. People
Really?
took me in like a long lost son, and they say in Kazakh traditional culture, for example, that first time as a guest you're a friend, second time you're part of the family, third time you can save a life. And amongst the many probably families, probably 90 to 100 I stayed with, that's genuinely the way I felt I was treated.
Interesting. At what time in your travels were you most fearful?
Probably the very beginning was the most exciting and the most terrifying. And I turned up in Mongolia initially by bicycle. I'd been riding across Russia to China with my friend Chris. I was exhilarated to see nomads for the first time. There was a moment one day we'd been pushing our bikes through the Gobi Desert. We'd been struggling, running out of food and water, and in fact my bike just snapped in half, the frame. But these people would just appear from nowhere. They'd materialise over the horizon, come galloping over, they'd say hello, give us a handful of dried curd known as adel, or maybe a swig of a fermented mare's milk known as arg. And then they'd gallop off wherever they wanted. And it struck me that here I was, this wimpy tourist, pushing my bikes along a fairly miserable, predetermined path. These people had a world of complete freedom. No fences. They only owned as many possessions as they could fit on the back of their own animals. They could go wherever they pleased, and I wanted to know, more about who these people were. So 3 years later, I turned up in Mongolia. I'd planned it for 18 months, but nonetheless, I was still terrified of horses. I'd only ever ridden once when I was about 7. I'd been bucked off and broken my arm quite badly, and I'll never forget starting the trip, because only 5 days in, I woke up in the middle of the night and I could just hear these horses galloping off and realised that they were mine. And that was one of the terrifying moments, to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning in this big open dark space, the wind clapping at the tent, abandoned by my animals. It's a little bit like losing your boat on the ocean out there.
I'm sure.
And yeah.
We were just playing some video I was going to get you to respond to a little bit. Sure. So, and I guess basically in that particular video, from watching the documentary or watching pieces of the documentary, you made some friends there that helped you with your horses. And one of the things that I found interesting was the fact that I guess you reached a certain point where you could not take your horses into the country, and you had to sell your horses and then buy new horses. So tell that story.
Yeah, unfortunately, the horses I used in Mongolia, and Mongolia was kind of like the apprenticeship of my journey. I learned to become a horseman. It was also the honeymoon of the trip, summertime and nomads. But no, I couldn't get the horses out of the country because of quarantine laws. In Mongolia, the horses are still considered national treasures. I had to sell them on the border, cross into Kazakhstan, where the adventure began, looking for new animals. And in any country, I think finding a good horse is a tough ask, particularly when you're a new arrival. And these old horses would be wheeled out. They'd be passed off as being 5-year-olds that would gallop to Hungary. They were actually 25 years old and only a few steps from the grave. But eventually I was offered 2 wonderful horses to buy. One of them was called Ogonyok. His name means small flame. He was a very strong, big pack animal. And I was also offered this horse called Taskini, who was a 12-year-old gelding, a wonderful kind of leader, had a sense of responsibility. I knew he'd keep them in line. Those 2 horses that I bought, with the help of people that you may have just seen in the footage, those 2 horses carried me all the way to Hungary. And I always say that the horses were the true heroes of this trip. It'd be fraudulent of me to say that it was a solo journey, because of course I had my 3 horses, and what we haven't spoken about yet, and you might be seeing shortly in the footage here, is my other loyal companion, which was my dog Tiggin.
Tiggin, okay.
Yeah.
And he was very important to your journey. And as I understand it, at one point, and you just mentioned that a few minutes ago, that he was stolen and almost died, right?
Yeah, poor Tiggin. Just to step back a little bit, I was, when I arrived in Kazakhstan, as I said, I was kind of new to the place. I bought my horses. One of the challenging things was that winter was already upon us. In fact, it turned out to be the coldest winter in about 40 years in that part of Kazakhstan. It dropped to, in Fahrenheit, roughly minus 55 degrees. And they have what they call on the steppe zuds, these very harsh conditions that sweep across the prairies, also known as the steppe, wiping out animals in their millions. Fortunately, this guy, Asset, decided to guide me for the first couple of weeks. And at the end of that time, he said to me, you need a friend on this long road, someone to keep you warm at night in the tent, and most importantly, protect you from wolves. And he gave me this tiny little scrawny pup. His name was Tiggin, which means fast wind or hawk. Tiggin at that stage, I didn't think was going to survive more than a couple of weeks in the cold, but within a few days we were inseparable. And Tiggin grew into a man. I didn't realise till later, of course, that as we went to sleep at night, he was thinking to himself, thank God Tim's protecting me from the wolves. But we both got some really good sleep, and I couldn't have done this journey without Tiggin. He kind of led the way in many ways. He was so spoilt by local people sometimes that by the end, he would no longer accept bread from strangers unless it was first lathered with cream and jam.
So when I want to go back because I thought it was interesting. When he was stolen, you found him, and he was almost frozen, I guess. Is that and so I understand you had to put him on a diet of vodka and what was it? Tell that story.
Well, while I was in Akbakaya, the place I was telling you about, one of the delays was when Tiggin was stolen by these unemployed mine workers, and he disappeared for a week. We'd kind of given up hope. I found a local friend in a man called Baidak, and Baidak promised that he'd do his best to find Tiggin. Unfortunately, Baidak's own dog was stolen and eaten while he looked for mine. He found Tiggin, he rescued him. Tiggin was in a very bad way, but he was brought back to life in a sauna and actually given raw eggs and vodka as a local in a sauna. Yeah. And 3 weeks later, Tiggin could walk again. And that was just one of the many lives of Tiggin. One of my friends once said, thank God that Tiggin was not a cat, because cats only have 9 lives. He was stolen several times on this trip. There was one stage where he was hit by a car. I'll never forget that day, because I was riding through central Kazakhstan in the spring. He'd probably only seen a handful of cars in his life. We were forced to ride on a road for one of the first times, just a dirt gravel road. And from the horizon came this little speck, and it grew and it grew and it grew. And Tiggin was entranced. He stood in the middle of the road, ears forward, and then I realised Tiggin was not moving, and the car ran him over. I kind of looked away as he hit the bull bar. I looked back, and he was kind of sprawled out, unconscious on the road. I assumed that it was all over. However, when I went over to him, he opened one eye, kind of cocked his back leg as if he wanted to scratch on the belly. And then a motorbike turned up, and I said to the man, I waved him down and said, is there a veterinarian in the next village? And he said, I am the veterinarian from the next village.
Oh, wow.
So he bundled him into the sidecar on the motorbike, and 2 days later I turned up in the village, and he was being doted on by all the village children, being fed yogurt and milk and eggs and meat. And he recovered. He had a couple of broken ribs, concussion, but we went on, and he had his own remarkable adventure, always in parallel to mine.
Why did you choose to go from Mongolia to the Danube? Why that particular path?
Well, what struck me was that nomadic life is so different to my own. I grew up probably like many of you here, living in between 4 walls and a roof, a fixed address. Very, very different to this world out there, where people move with the seasons, packing their equipment, their home, their tent, on the back of camels. They don't have nice thick brick walls. They've only got a couple of inches of tent felt to insulate them from these incredible extremes that can range from well below freezing to about 120 degrees Fahrenheit in the summer. I wanted to know more about them, and more than that, the Mongols have had an incredible history that I was unaware of as a kid. They actually formed the largest land empire that's ever been, or this contiguous land empire. It's interesting to think that half the world's population today live in lands that Mongols once ruled. So I thought the only way to really understand these people and their culture is to get on a horse myself. And the plan was to ride from Mongolia into Europe, across places like Kazakhstan, southern Russia, Ukraine, to arrive back in the sedentary European world, looking at things through the prism of a nomad's mind, which I thought would be a really interesting way of doing things, because all too often we tend to look at these very different cultures through the prism of our lives,
right,
and
right.
The world looks very different from the back of a horse.
I can imagine. What most surprised you about the journey?
I think, I surprised myself as a person who had had no contact with horses, didn't really consider myself an animal person. Perhaps the best memories I've got are with the animals, and I can't imagine not being around animals anymore. Some of my favourite times were in the springtime in Kazakhstan, and it was honestly the closest thing to unadulterated freedom I've ever experienced. You've got this unending horizons panning out in every single direction. There are no fences. In fact, I didn't see a single fence for most of that 6,000 miles of the journey. Tiggin was off chasing hares and foxes on the horizon. I had my horses. I had a compass in one hand. There was no Monday to Friday. There was no 9 to 5. No one knew I existed except for the land around me. I could be anyone I wanted to be. Not even thoughts were hemmed in. And it was just a glorious sense of togetherness with my animals, of complete freedom, and I guess I dreamed of experiencing that, but I never really thought that I'd experience it to that degree, and that surprised me. But also it was the people. I've got to say that turning up in the desert in the summertime, it was very, very hot, so I had to ride purely through the night to keep the horses alive. I needed to find shelter before the sun came up, and I'd arrive at 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning on someone's doorstep, completely exhausted, sometimes just collapse right there and then. And these people would honestly just take me straight in. They'd lay out a mattress for me, give me a cup of tea. They'd take the horses away to somewhere where there was some fodder, some grass for them. Even Tiggin would be looked after. They say that you can tell if a host is respecting a guest if they feed your dog before their own. And they often made a point of doing that. They often didn't have much food for themselves or their own animals, but they'd bring out whatever they had for me. And I'll never forget that. And it was constantly surprising. They had no obligation, but they did it anyway.
I've got about 4 minutes left. If someone picks up a copy of your book, On the Trail of Genghis Khan, what will they learn?
I hope they'll be taken on a journey that will both be perhaps confronting at times, like it was for me, but mostly inspirational. They'll learn about a world that we don't hear about. They'll learn about myself and my 3 horses and my dog Tiggin. But most importantly, I think they'll get an insight into the lives of these very unique cultures and a land that is somehow, it's kind of beyond the ends of the earth as far as I was concerned growing up in Australia. I think that Central Asia and Mongolia, it's a part of the world that's kind of occupies a blind spot in our geographical knowledge, and I hope this book will paint a picture of my journey, but that I'll also be able to kind of humanise and paint a picture of that place that will it might subtly change the way you look at the world and enriching it.
What's next for Tim Cope?
I'm actually just beginning the writing of 2 children's books, an illustrated book about my dog Tigan for young children, 4 to 6-year-olds, and an adventure story for 10 to 14-year-old boys. I think that getting young boys into reading is a really important thing, particularly in my country, Australia, where it's sometimes hard to get young boys to read. Reading certainly is the way that I managed to venture well beyond the borders of my own country long before I was old enough to do so myself. And beyond that, I'd love to do another big adventure, to travel from India to Europe on the trail of gypsies, actually.
Okay.
The Romani people, from where they originated from to where they migrated over many hundreds of years.
Okay. Would you do that by yourself, or would you have a partner to do it with you? Or
that's a good question. I love doing that journey by horse alone. It was the first trip I'd ever done solo, so to speak. But would I do it again? Jury's out. If I could find a partner that I could, they'd be willing to do 4 years by horseback to Europe, that'd be great. But who knows? I think one of the great things about the lifestyle I've been able to lead is that it's pretty unpredictable.
Yeah, I can only imagine. So what was it like when you showed up in Hungary after this long journey? What was that moment like for you?
Well, people talk about anticlimaxes at the end of big journeys and projects, but mine was nothing of the kind. It was everything I could ever have dreamed of and much more. My mother came from Hungary. There were ambassadors from different countries. A huge crowd had gathered, and I kind of stepped my way through an avenue of honour and sat there reflecting on how this little embryo of an idea had come to fruition and consumed my whole life and drawn hundreds of other into it. And it still is like a dream to me.
Well, what a fascinating life you live. Best of luck to you. It was an absolute pleasure to meet you.
Thank you very much for having me.
You bet.
Thanks for having me in Alabama.
Yeah.
Oh, well, actually, we're in Florida here.
You're Florida, and you've been in Alabama.
Alabama, yeah.
So welcome to the U.S. and welcome to the Southeast. Tim Cope, he's an adventurer. He's also the author of On the Trail of Genghis Khan. What a fascinating story. Also has a DVD and a documentary by the same name, and you had the opportunity to see some of that footage earlier in our broadcast. By the way, you can keep up with Tim at timcopejourneys.com. And you can see more of our conversations there online at WSRE.org/conversations, as well as YouTube and Facebook. I'm Jeff Weeks. Thank you so very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the broadcast. Take great care of yourself, and we'll see you soon.
Support for this program is provided in part by these corporate sponsors. And by viewers like you.